Chapter 16 is about how the Federal Reserve uses monetary policy or changes in the money supply to affect aggregate demand and help stabilize the economy. The Fed's use of monetary policy relates directly to interest rates. So we're going to start this chapter by looking at interest rates and specifically by looking at the supply and demand graph for money. We will take a quick look at the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, which we're going to use when we talk about the 4 different tools of monetary policy. So this is how the Federal Reserve can change the money supply. What do they actually do to make those changes? Next, we're going to discuss the Fed targets. That's their dual mandate of full employment and stable prices. And we'll look at what their policy targets are for those 2 things. The last thing we'll do is apply the monetary policy that we've learned about so far in this unit to what we did in the last unit with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So we're going to put everything together that we've learned so far. We'll start our discussion by talking about interest rates. Interest rates are the price paid for the use of money. You can also think of it as interest rates is the cost of borrowing money. There are many different interest rates in the economy. We've talked about a few so far, like the federal funds rate. There's also interest rates on mortgages, interest rates on credit cards, interest rates on your savings account. So even though there's many different interest rates, we're going to talk in this chapter as if there's only one interest rate. And the reason why we can simplify in this matter is because interest rates always move together. So if one interest rate is moving up, the rest of the interest rates in the economy are increasing as well. Interest rates in the economy are determined by the supply and demand of money. And that's what we're going to look into now. Let's start by talking about the demand for money. Now, I want you to realize when we're talking about demand for money, I'm not talking about demand for wealth. When we're discussing money, we're talking about the most liquid form of assets. So, how much money do you want to hold of everything that you own? How much do you want to hold in your checking account or in cash? That's what the demand for money is. There's 2 different things that determine the total demand for money in the nation. The first one is transactions demand. This is the amount of money that we need on hand to purchase goods and services. So this is determined by the nominal GDP, which is the total amount of goods and services that are produced in the nation. The transactions demand for money is not determined by the interest rate. It's just determined by how many goods and services people are buying. The second part of the demand for money is the asset demand. And this just means that we hold some of our assets, some of our wealth in the most liquid form, in money. This would be like having an emergency savings fund. So there's no risk to keeping money in my checking account for emergencies, but whenever the interest rate is less than the inflation, then that money is losing purchasing power every year. Asset demand for money varies inversely with the interest rate. This means if interest rates are very high, I'm unlikely to keep a lot of my emergency saving fund in my checking account. I'm going to move that away from my checking account and I'm going to put it in some other financial investment where I will actually be earning interest on that money. So if interest rates are high, the demand for money will be low. I don't want to keep very much in my checking account. And then vice versa. So if interest rates are very low, if I'm only earning 0.5% in my savings account or in bonds, I might as well just keep my cash in my checking account. So if interest rates are very low, then the asset demand for money will be high. These 2 pieces will equal together to be the total demand for money. So if you're solving for the total demand for money, just add together transactions demand and asset demand. Now let's take a look at the graph. The first graph here is showing us the transaction demand for money. On the bottom, we have the amount of money demanded, and on the vertical axis, we have the interest rate. So I mentioned on the last slide that the transactions demand for money is not dependent upon the interest rate. That's why we have a vertical line here. It's just going to be equal to the nominal GDP. The next graph here is the asset demand for money. So we have the same graph here. So we have the amount of money demanded on the bottom and interest rates on the side. This time you can see that the demand curve is downward sloping. That means when real interest rates are low, then the asset demand for money is very high. And if interest rates increase, then the asset demand for money will be lower. So that's where we can see our inverse relationship between the rate of interest and the asset demand for money. In the last graph here, we have our total demand for money, that's here. To find the total demand for money, you just add together the asset demand plus the transactions demand. So you can see at an interest rate of 2.5, the asset demand for money was 150 and the transaction demand for money was 100. If you add them together, you get 250. And that's where this point comes from right here. So interest rate of 2.5, the total demand for money is 250. You can also see that we continue to have this inverse relationship. As interest rates rise, then the total demand for money will decrease. You can also see on this graph the supply of money. So remember that the supply of money, or the money supply, is dependent upon the Fed. So the Fed has the power to shift the supply of money to the right or to the left to increase or decrease the supply of money. And notice it's a vertical line. That's because it is not dependent upon the interest rate. It's dependent upon the choices of the Board of the Governor of the Federal Reserve. So this graph here, the supply and demand of money, is where the equilibrium interest rate comes from, or where the interest rates come from in the economy. Where these two lines intersect, then we get our equilibrium interest rate, which in this case looks like it's going to be 5%. The equilibrium interest rate will change depending on the shifts happening in the money supply and money demand. So the Federal Reserve can increase or decrease the supply of money to increase or decrease the interest rate. If the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, then interest rates will decrease, and vice versa. If the Federal Reserve decreases the supply of money, then interest rates will increase. This is the most important takeaway that's going to affect what we talk about later. So make sure you put a star by this and you know this relationship, that the money supply is increasing, interest rates decrease, and vice versa. Now we're going to take a look at the balance sheet for the Federal Reserve. Previously, we've looked at the balance sheet for commercial banks, and this one looks a little bit different. This is a simplified but accurate balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. This is from February 28, 2019. So you can get an idea of what the Federal Reserve has in assets and liabilities. Their assets include all of the securities that they've purchased over time, as well as loans that they've made to commercial banks. Remember, we said that the Federal Reserve makes loans to banks, but not to individuals. Their liabilities include the reserves of the commercial banks. So remember, the commercial banks have assets that they keep on reserve at the Fed. So reserves at commercial banks are the commercial bank's assets, but those reserves that are held at the Fed, for the Federal Reserve, those are liabilities. Their next liability is Treasury deposits. This is the money that the federal U.S. government has on deposit at the Fed. So recall a few chapters ago, we said one of the functions of the Federal Reserve is to be a fiscal agent for the federal government. That means that the Fed is the bank of the federal government. The next liability, Federal Reserve notes, that is currency. So all of the bills and coins that are outstanding outside of the Federal Reserve that people have, that's actually a liability or a debt for the Federal Reserve. And this is just the basics or the most important parts of the assets and liabilities of the Fed that you need to know. They do have some other assets as well as some other liabilities and net worth. In this video lecture, we've just introduced the concepts of interest rates and the Federal Reserve balance sheet. In the next video, we're going to dig deeper into monetary policy and how the Fed can actually change the money supply.